Intermediary liability and security. One of the most cherished and deeply enshrined principles of Internet policy in the United States, particularly when it comes to dealing with copyright infringement and free speech issues, is the idea that online intermediaries are not responsible for the content that other people post or provide through their platforms. Articulated in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and further refined in the safe harbor provisions of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, this principle of intermediary liability is often hailed as the reason that websites built on user-generated content, such as YouTube and Wikipedia, are able to exist at all, without the threat of crippling copyright infringement or defamation lawsuits hanging over them. Section 230 established a distinction between publishers, or companies who vet the content they post and therefore are liable for it, and platforms, or companies that merely serve as neutral forums for anyone to post anything they want without preemptive screening. This distinction between platforms and publishers, and the legal protections afforded to the former group, are important for online companies, because on the Internet, everyone is reliant on many layers of intermediaries. These include Internet service providers, who carry traffic between servers, hosting providers, who rent out server space, registrars, who sell and manage domain names, software developers, who design applications like web browsers and email clients that users rely on to access online information, hardware manufacturers, who build the physical devices that users rely on to access those applications, search engines, who organize and prioritize information users are looking for, and ad networks that distribute and serve online advertisements to external websites. The underlying principle of intermediary liability protection is essentially that each of these actors is only responsible for its own behavior online and not that of anyone else who is using its service. More specifically, as articulated in Section 230, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. On the Internet, in other words, most intermediaries, who are not deliberately picking and choosing what they want to publish in the manner of newspapers or magazines, qualify as platforms rather than publishers, and therefore bear no responsibility for what the people who use them choose to say or do through their services. These legal protections insulate many Internet companies from having to worry about copyright infringement or police illegal speech on their platforms, and that has helped many of those firms flourish and grow. But as the principle of intermediary liability has seeped into the security realm, it has proved much more problematic as a means of protecting third-party intermediaries from bearing any of the blame associated with crimes committed by other people using their platforms. When it comes to security, the network of intermediaries and stakeholders involved can be understood very broadly, going beyond strictly technical interactions and interdependencies. Firms rely on policymakers to help them figure out which security controls they should be using. They rely on the people and organizations they regularly communicate with to keep their accounts and servers secure. They rely on their employees not to respond to phishing emails or be careless with their login credentials, and they often rely on third-party contractors and vendors to provide them with, among other things, security monitoring, data storage, and analysis services. Additionally, firms that are working to protect their own data and systems can themselves become intermediaries or platforms for attacks on other targets if their user accounts and servers are compromised and used as hot points for staging intrusions directed at other institutions. On the Internet, everyone is an intermediary, or at the very least, has the potential to serve as one in an attack directed at someone else. In the context of a policy landscape built largely around limiting intermediary liability, there is very little understanding of how these different stakeholders ought to share responsibility for a breach in its aftermath. There is always someone else for each intermediary to point to as partly responsible and to try to shift liability onto, rather than focusing on strengthening security themselves, as in the case of the payment networks, banks, and retailers fighting over who will cover the costs of payment card fraud. The intermediary liability protections for online speech codified in Section 230 are not the only examples of policymakers working to roll back liability in this area. Many cybersecurity information sharing policy proposals, including the CISA law, include measures that absolve companies of liability in the hopes of enabling more sharing about online threats that will allow for better real-time remediation and long-term data collection. One of the rationales for protecting companies from being held responsible for the security information they reveal under a statute like CISA is that there is no way to learn about these threats and the larger security landscape, no way to measure which security controls actually work and which ones don't, unless the firms who are fending off attacks and experimenting with security controls feel comfortable revealing their successes and failures. Recall how the FCC wrestled with the problem of trying to measure whether its anti-bot code of conduct had had any impact at all, by asking the service providers themselves to tell the agency whether they had seen any signs of progress, encouraging firms to report more about the types of threats they witness and what controls, policies, or practices, if any, help mitigate them, is crucial for trying to measure what works and what doesn't. And promising that those firms can't be sued for what they report is one way of trying to make that happen. In other words, rolling back the potential liability of intermediaries and Internet companies in the short term may be partly intended to help figure out exactly what security practices and controls work best against current threats, and who should be implementing them for maximal impact. This approach could ultimately yield improved empirical guidance on defenses and also help shape how insurance companies can better model cyber risks and audit customers for cyber insurance. Long-term, such policies may actually help to formalize liability regimes and insurance markets more effectively, using empirical evidence in the future. But for that to work, the protections from liability and rewards for reporting information voluntarily will have to be short-term incentives designed to help build a more definitive structure in which those same guarantees won't hold. The risk is that instead of translating into more clearly defined security responsibilities and liability regimes in the future, these legal protections for online intermediaries sharing security information may well turn out to be permanent, especially once firms have grown accustomed to them. As more organizations outsource their data storage and management to large cloud-based providers, the issues of intermediary liability as they relate to security incidents become more complicated because security responsibilities end up split among multiple different firms. The private contracts cloud service customers sign with those large providers may help clarify some of those divisions of responsibility. But, as is often the case when private actors get to dictate liability regimes themselves, those contracts will probably be designed to prioritize protecting the interests of their authors, typically the cloud service providers, above the security of stored data. Given the current landscape of uncertain liability, it makes sense that most intermediaries are trying to avoid shouldering any responsibility for security, even in areas in which they might be able to make a big difference, for fear that they will then become the de facto responsible parties. It would be expecting a lot for firms to voluntarily assume those responsibilities without a push from policymakers or courts. And yet, so far, those policies have operated largely on a voluntary basis, as in the case of the FCC's Anti-Bot Code of Conduct, or avoided defining any clear-cut responsibilities, as in the ruling against Wyndham in its challenge to the FTC. Policymakers and courts have been reluctant, it seems, to go too far down the path of trying to sort out who, among the many possible intermediaries, should be specifically responsible for doing what. One reason these disputes over liability are messy and often confusing is that not only are there many different types of intermediaries when it comes to online security, but several of them are largely invisible to the general public, as well as to policymakers. This was an important element of the DigiNotar compromise, the challenge of conveying to the people whose email accounts had been compromised what exactly a certificate authority was, and why the potential compromise of thousands of Iranian Google accounts was the fault of a Dutch CA, not Google. In that particular case, DigiNotar clearly bore the brunt of the consequences for the compromise when it went out of business. But rather than clarify the division of security responsibilities between certificate authorities and browser manufacturers, the DigiNotar incident instead marked the beginning of an ongoing back and forth between the two groups of stakeholders trying to force each other to assume greater responsibility for users' security online. The major browsing vendors have considerable power to influence CA's behavior by threatening to remove them from their list of trusted root CAs. But the CAs have an odd kind of power of their own. Most online users don't really understand who they are or what they do. That means browser manufacturers' ultimate power, refusing to load the websites with certificates issued by CAs they deem to be disreputable, has the potential to backfire if users blame the browser, not the CA, for not being able to reach a certain website. This is related to the strategy of the Stophouse group that launched the denial-of-service attack directed at Spamhaus in hopes that any resulting slowdown or disruption from the attack would drive away Spamhaus's customers, even though the attack was the direct result of Spamhaus doing its job and blacklisting malicious online actors. Providing users with stronger security protections would ideally reward a company with more customers, not fewer. But if those customers don't understand what they're being protected from, or why, that principle may not necessarily hold true, complicating companies' decisions about how best to approach security from a business standpoint. The liability issues surrounding security incidents are further complicated by the ways many computer security breaches primarily affect customers and users who played no role in securing the data in the first place, and the extent to which those breaches often involve multiple intermediary parties. But they are also spurred in part by the challenges associated with catching and prosecuting the perpetrators of these attacks. The attribution challenges posed by computer networks do not make computer incidents impossible to defend against, but they do put greater pressure on non-law enforcement stakeholders to provide protections, and they often mean those stakeholders are left with no one to blame but each other when things go wrong. There are rare exceptions where people are more willing to view breached organizations as victims and focus blame and repercussions on the perpetrators. This is most often the case when news of an incident is coupled with an immediate and forceful accusation about who was behind it, as happened with the report on PLA Unit 61398 and the Sony breach. In the absence of a clear enemy to hold responsible, users and policymakers end up focusing blame on the breached organizations, and those organizations, in turn, devote their time and energy to trying to shift defensive responsibilities onto each other. Everyone involved in this process is prone to rapidly losing sight of how limited each stakeholder's individual window into security incidents really is, and how blindly those stakeholders are often forced to make decisions and exercise control without knowing exactly what they are defending against or how it can best be prevented. Who can do what? The incidents described in the first 3 sections of this book are organized around 3 common, sometimes overlapping motives: financial gain, political and economic espionage, and public humiliation of the victims. Tracing these incidents from their unassuming technical beginnings to their sweeping, sometimes devastating ends highlights how many different stages and how many different intermediaries are involved in any individual breach, and how significantly the perpetrator's ultimate aims shape the landscape of possible defenses and defenders. This perspective, focused on the perpetrator's end goals, diverges from many attempts to classify security intrusions by their earlier technical stages, such as phishing, software vulnerabilities, or stolen credentials. Those technical means of access cut across incidents perpetrated for every reason, from financial fraud to espionage to vengeance. And while the controls and defensive techniques aimed at preventing intrusions at these early stages are important, they are only one element of a larger defensive landscape. Looking at security from the perspective of restricting those early technical stages of intrusions means classifying attacks according to the behaviors and activities that attackers exploit in the context of computer systems, even if those behaviors are not themselves directly harmful. It means restricting those capabilities so that adversaries have to do more work to acquire them, and legitimate users have more signals to indicate when those early stages of an intrusion are being attempted. This approach defines computer security incidents not by how they end, but rather by how they begin, and attackers not by what they want to achieve, but by how they achieve it. This is a fundamentally general notion of defense, one that offers defenders a vague charge to prevent the unwanted and unknown, even if they are unsure where those unwanted and unknown activities may be leading. Most importantly, these various technical maneuvers are often interchangeable to perpetrators, so defending against one will not necessarily prevent attackers from being able to find another path to their ultimate goal. Looking at security incidents from the other end, however, from the perspective of what the perpetrators are aiming to accomplish, can offer a more specific picture of what defenders are trying to protect against by organizing attacks according to their ultimate goal rather than their particular implementation. Instead of trying to restrict the unknown or unexpected, mitigations that focus on blocking perpetrators from meeting their end goals focus directly on what those intruders ultimately want and how to prevent them from achieving that result. These end goals often occur beyond the context of a targeted computer system, in forms that include large-scale financial fraud, sale of products designed using stolen intellectual property, targeting of undercover spies, or broadcasting stolen information, and therefore, by necessity, Defending against these stages of attacks requires the intervention of stakeholders beyond just the breached firm or agency. These final attack stages are often ones perpetrators cannot easily replace if blocked. They are the whole point of the breach, not merely a means to an end, like a phishing email or a stolen password. These two framings help reconcile some of the conflicting general wisdom around computer defense, particularly the tension around whether attackers or defenders have the advantage in the context of computer systems. This is the tension between the Wild West model, in which the attackers supposedly have every advantage, and the kill chain model, in which defenders have the advantage because they only need to stop one stage of an incident. The former model corresponds closely to trying to defend against all the possible early technical intrusion stages, when defenders have to find and protect every possible access pathway to be effective, and attackers only need to find one open avenue of attack because these pathways are so easily replaceable or substituted for each other. The kill chain model, by contrast, speaks to the framing that focuses on attacker end goals, or the final stages of an attack that are so absolutely essential to the perpetrator's success that if they can be interrupted, the entire incident is effectively thwarted. Assessing where defenders may have some advantages over attackers also requires understanding which defenders may be most advantageously poised to interrupt certain types of attacks. The three classes of defenders discussed in the previous chapters, application designers, organizations, and policymakers, are able to intervene at very different stages of security breaches. Application designers can contribute primarily to defense efforts aimed at early stages of intrusions by distinguishing between malicious and legitimate capabilities and placing more cumbersome restrictions on the former. Organizations are well poised to address intermediate stages of incidents that occur within the bounds of their own computer systems, particularly through careful monitoring and restriction of outbound network traffic. Policymakers have a more limited ability than organizations to restrict information flows to attackers, but can do much more to cut off illicit money flows and interrupt financially motivated security incidents, as well as collect the needed information to understand how these incidents occur and who is best poised to interrupt them and prevent perpetrators from achieving their ultimate goals. When we talk about and report on and litigate security incidents, our inclination is too often to latch on to the earliest or most easily understood point of access, the phishing email, the software vulnerability, the unprotected wireless network, and harp on the defense that seems like it would have made all the difference at that one particular stage: two-factor authentication, or software patches, or WPA encryption. But that perspective oversimplifies the much more complicated narrative of the gradual, escalating capabilities acquired by perpetrators, as well the more limited and challenging environment that individual defenders operate in, constrained both by the extent to which they can see and control access attempts, and by their ability to witness and mitigate the ultimate harms that the perpetrators wish to inflict. The optimistic takeaway from security breaches like those discussed in this book is that there are lots of opportunities for defending against computer security incidents, and lots of stakeholders who can help contribute to those efforts. The more pessimistic interpretation is that each of those stakeholders can, on its own, have only a relatively small impact by implementing defensive measures, forcing only a slight readjustment of attackers' plans rather than a dramatic increase in the work and resources required of the perpetrator. Many of those stakeholders are understandably reticent to play an active role in security or assume any responsibility voluntarily, while policymakers are often equally reluctant to interfere in a space they believe private industry is better equipped to handle itself. Policymakers are not wrong to believe that many, though not all, companies possess more technical expertise and familiarity with online threats than regulators do, but they are wrong to assume that this technical sophistication is the only thing needed, or indeed the most important thing needed, to resolve computer security risks. The mistakes made by TJX, SCDOR, DigiNotar, OPM, Sony, and others were not primarily due to a lack of available technical tools or resources. They were due to an unclear understanding of their responsibilities when it came to protecting computer systems, a lack of well-defined liability regimes indicating just how much they stood to lose in the event of a major compromise, and a vast network of other stakeholders who they thought would, at the very least, share in those losses. Policymakers who embrace a wait-and-see regulatory approach because they are counting on industry to take the lead on addressing cybersecurity challenges risk confusing the technical know-how of the private sector with the much less technical judicial and political skills required to sort out liability issues and collective action problems, and to coordinate disparate, diffuse groups of intermediaries. It is the professed hope of many policymakers that cybersecurity, at least for non-government computer systems, will be handled by industry. Wheeler articulated that philosophy when he described letting industry move first, with policymakers sitting back to assess how they're doing and, perhaps, taking vague, undefined steps later on, if insufficient progress is made. But that model gets the order of who should act when precisely backward. For cybersecurity threats to be effectively addressed by industry, and for the risks and losses associated with computer systems to be handled by companies and insurers in a way that takes full advantage of each stakeholder's particular security capabilities and scope of control, policymakers first need to step in and help sort out which stakeholders should be responsible for doing what, and how policy-based incentives and penalties can be used to achieve that end. Otherwise, those determinations will be made by the industry stakeholders themselves, with the largest and most powerful of them, like the payment networks and service providers, shifting responsibility onto the rest, even though those large and powerful firms are often the ones best poised to exercise the most far-reaching and effective lines of defense. It is precisely these dynamics and negotiations among different stakeholders that have been the greatest hindrance to identifying defensive bottlenecks, leveraging the capabilities of different intermediary stakeholders, and strengthening cybersecurity in the early 21st century. These conflicts have shaped the security ecosystem's disregard for the crucial lessons of past incidents, and dismissal of these breaches as nothing more than the result of poor technical decisions on the part of people like Archuleta about which security controls to purchase and implement. So much changes about cybersecurity incidents from month to month and from year to year, but so much also stays the same. What the perpetrators are after, which applications they primarily use to initiate access, and what infrastructural components and configurations they rely on to carry out their ultimate goals. It is these recurring patterns that are most helpful in trying to identify the bottleneck stages of incident life cycles. They indicate which elements of cybersecurity incidents remain static across time because perpetrators are so dependent on them, and have so few alternatives. Locating these bottlenecks helps, in turn, to identify which stakeholders may be able to cut off or mitigate these particular attack stages. Characterizing the set of stakeholders who are best poised to contribute to overall defensive efforts and the potential roles each can play, in this manner sets the stage for making policies that leverage and combine these different capabilities effectively. The variety of different intermediaries and competing interests involved in cybersecurity incidents has largely served to undermine cybersecurity efforts and progress. But that diversity of stakeholders and their combined reach and influence should be an asset when it comes to security. Recognizing the full defensive potential those stakeholders can wield together, however, will require policies focused on building relationships between those intermediaries in ways that actually take advantage of the complexity and interconnectedness of the online ecosystem to strengthen Internet security. This concludes the reading of You'll See This Message When It Is Too Late: The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches by Josephine Wolff, copyright 2018 by Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This book was read by Kate Redding. This unabridged recording was produced in 2018 by Blackstone Publishing, which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Publishing. If you would like to obtain a monthly update telling you about new releases, call 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www.downpour.com. Thank you.